For the 85th time, we are gathering to discuss cashew markets. Good day and welcome to another session of the Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. Session is available in French and English. You can access your preferred language via the globe icon on the bottom right side of your screen. For today's webinar, Jim Fitzpatrick will enlighten us around the theme, what does the future hold for the cashew supply, demand and trade? A long-term perspective. We are streaming live on the ACA Facebook page and on the ACA YouTube channel, where you could also find the recordings of all past 84 sessions. Remember that as the session goes, you can ask your questions and leave your comments in the discussion box below. As usual, we are grateful for our partners and sponsors that are making this webinar possible. The European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States, the GIZ Move Com Cashew Projects, the Sustainable Nuts Initiative, and the Cashew Club. Before inviting Jim, I would like to remind you that you are 104 days to the 19th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Exposition. From November 18th to 21st of this year in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, we will discuss around the theme, Unlocking Cashew Investment Opportunities for Sustainable Economic Growth. Remember now that registration for early bird ends on August 21st. Please hurry up. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Yep, all good. Trying to enjoy the summer.
It's been
Weather
a
is
while. We missed
frustrating.
you.
It's been nearly a month. A lot has happened.
Yes, nearly. We are ready for you.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. You're very welcome wherever you are. Today, we're going to break with our normal practice and we're going to look far forward. We're going to think about cashews and how they might look 10 years from now. So we won't completely abandon our normal practice. We'll have a quick look at the markets and the trade. Not a great deal to report really, but nonetheless interesting, more interesting than normal for the time of year. Then we're going to look at the future. We're going to look at some of the long-term trends, some of the prospects for the future, and I would invite everyone to comment or question or just make an observation on the subject of today's talk. So let's go. Let's talk about the market. What have we seen lately? What's changed? Well, if we look at this market, I'm calling it a kind of range bound. That means that it is trading in a range of prices without making any signs of breaking out. We have some pressure for lower prices. We have some pressure for higher prices, but right now it doesn't look as if there's anything too strong. Lower prices, well, the fact that it is a rather quiet time of year. It's August after all, time of year that tends to be quiet, particularly from a kernels buyer's point of view. Also, the crops are getting bigger. That sounds strange, doesn't it? What's happening is that the early estimates are being corrected and places like Ivory Coast are upgrading their crop estimates, 1.5 million tons from there recently. Buyers are under no pressure. They're under no pressure because of the time of year on kernels. They're under no pressure on RCN because imports are at really high levels, both to India and to Vietnam. Indian rupee is a bit weaker. That discourages Indian buyers from imports and could have an impact on the market as the year goes on. The US trade is down and the US economy, with a lot of negative signals in the last week, might be on the verge of a recession, and that could have an impact of demand. And of course, our southern hemisphere crops, Brazil, Indonesia, Tanzania, Mozambique, well, they're only weeks away now, and that's an influence on prices. So there are significant downward influences on prices, and maybe that's what's keeping the market at the lower end of the range for now, but it's not breaking out. On the other side, there are significant factors that could force prices back up. Demand is resilient. Vietnam released their July trade figures today, just this morning, and we see the highest exports for any July on record. That's really quite impressive, over 67,000 tonnes. The busy season is approaching. That's much more of an impact in markets like India, for example, where Diwali is coming in October, and buying is sometimes left a little bit late for that. In India, when we look at the economic situation there, we see some positive signals. And I was reading an article this week in the Hindu Times talking about a domestic demand-driven economy growing quickly, 6 to 7% over the next year. That's going to have an impact on demand for cashew nuts. And also focusing on Asian demand, Chinese imports of cashews this year are literally off the charts. Quite remarkable what's going on cashews in the Chinese market. And there are other factors that have been there for a long time. For example, the margin.
Hello, Jim. Can you hear me? Hello, everyone. Our apologies for the slight technical challenge. We'll be back in a while. We are trying to reconnect. Thank you for your patience.
En Afrique et en Asie, augmenter la... Video, video, and opportunities. Like,
Thank you for waiting a little for us. Jim will be with us shortly. He has a reboot of his laptop. Kindly give us a couple of minutes and we'll be back. Thank you. Hi, Jim. Welcome back.
Hi, Stella. Sorry, everyone. I have no idea what happened there, but I know it happened. Bit of a panic here, but we're back in business by the looks of it.
Thank you, Jim.
Now, before I was rudely interrupted by myself, we were talking about the market, and I was just talking about the fact that the kernels market looks a little bit range bound for the moment. No sign of a breakout either side. Let's get back to that. Let's talk about the raw cashew nuts. So hopefully you can see my screen, and hopefully you can hear me. Stella, you're going to help me if it's not working.
Yes, Jim, we can hear you. We can see you.
Okay, and the slides you can see also, I hope.
We can also see the slides. Yes,
Don't you love technology? Like all things,
we do.
absolutely fabulous until it doesn't work. Okay, let's go. So raw cashew nut prices, relatively steady prices, particularly if you've got good quality material, and good quality material at this time of year is starting to run out. There is still some excellent quality material left in Guinea-Bissau, a little bit maybe in Senegal, and we can see that prices are rising for that higher quality material. But elsewhere, and there are some significant volumes left in some countries as crop estimates have risen, we now know that, and lower quality material is only making lower prices for the time being. A little bit of pressure on the market, cash flow pressure in the buying countries, although the healthy exports from Vietnam will help that over the next 4 or 5 weeks as those July shipments start to turn into cash. Looking at kernels, it is at the lower end of the range where we see a range around 305 to 320. That would be the lower end of the recent range. Maybe there's one or two people below that, maybe there's many people above that, but that's roughly what we're seeing. African prices continuing to hold the premiums, relatively unchanged. Generally speaking, African processors are quite well sold at this stage. Buyers are quiet. We had a little bit of clarity on the United States tariffs. That came, and then of course it went, as has become the pattern. So again, a little bit of uncertainty introduced. But look, we're in cashews, we live with uncertainty. It's been that way for as long as I can remember. Meantime, demand is steady, apart from the US. The impact of this disruption to US demand, I think, is likely to be in either in Q1 or Q2 of 2026. Right now, shipments remain quite healthy, and there were significantly high shipments end of last year, start of this year to the US, but that's all changing. Supply side, a couple of factors. Looking at Vietnam, wow, look at those July import figures. Vietnam is 6.5% up on last year's imports. That's remarkable. 1.897, let's call it 1.9 million tons imported by the end of July. That's remarkable. No signs of any shortage of raw material there. But exports also performing outstandingly, according to the figures from the Vietnamese Customs Authority. 413,000 tons of kernels exported in the first half. That's only half of 1% less than last year, which was, by miles, the all-time record. Now it's interesting, when we looked at the Vietnamese figures, we see further imports from Cambodia, 26,000 tons in the month of July. That is unusual. Our friends in Cambodia had said to us that people were holding some stocks, and it looks like that was correct information. So Vietnam now reports a total of 915,000 tons imported from Cambodia. That's way ahead of last year's number. That starts to suggest that the Cambodian crop is not only more than 900,000 tons as we thought, but could be more than 950,000 tons. The 1 million ton mark is not that far away. Now, I don't see any particular significance of reaching 1 million other than the milestone for the producers of Cambodia. So Cambodia consolidates its position as the second largest producer, and the big crop gets bigger. India, significant imports. So I'm a little bit looking at some of the chat rather than the actual statistics in India, because the import statistics come out relatively slowly. Same happens here in Europe. It takes a couple of months before the figures come out. But we've read reports of a total of 730,000 tons imported. Crop situation, well, I get all kinds of stories. So I'm hearing from some people who are telling me this is a poor crop, that it was a short crop because of the early onset of the monsoon. We know that's correct, of course. Others are saying, no, this is not a bad crop at all. So we've got a wide range, somewhere between 650 and 750,000 tons. I'm sure our friends in India would like to give us some correct numbers. Maybe if there's someone online, they could talk to us about that a little bit later on. That to me means India needs about 350,000 tons additional RCN based on a strong economy, mind you, a weaker rupee, and a faster spreading and stronger monsoon than we've seen for some years. It looks like it's, according to the reports, fastest monsoon since 2020. That's good for the Indian economy, and in the long run, that's good for demand for cashew nuts in India. Looking at the East African crops on their way very soon, positive forecasts, weather looks okay. This looks like we could be looking at another very good crop in Tanzania and Mozambique, as forecast by the regulatory bodies there. And we're hoping on the first GME in September, we're going to focus on Tanzania, and we're hoping to have some guests from Tanzania to talk to us about the prospects for that crop. Moving on in West Africa, I've mentioned that Cote d'Ivoire has upgraded the official estimate now to 1.5 million tonnes. People are saying that there could be as much as 100,000 tonnes still left on farm in small country warehouses. That's interesting. That's quite late for that to be happening. Of course, unfortunately, the quality of that material is likely to be lower. Again, probably, looking at prices of RCN, they're obviously influenced by quality. So if you see lower prices from Cote d'Ivoire, it could be more about quality than about any change in the market. In Benin, still the troubles with developing processing continue. Reading recently in the African Cashew Alliance, AfriCashew Splits, the fortnightly cashew market magazine, only about 27,000 tonnes processed so far. That's going to rise, maybe 50, 55,000 tonnes, but far less than the target of 120,000 tonnes hoped for, discussed, even forecast earlier in the year. Nigeria, new processing announced, that's good to see, and Nigerian processing seems to be well on its way. And in Ghana, not so good news. Some processors are struggling, often the smaller processors, and Ghana is mostly smaller processors. We're looking at a situation of, I'm not going to say crisis, but certainly a pause in the development of processing in Ghana, unfortunately. Let's have a look then at the situation in Guinea-Bissau. So, and this is positive looking to me. And looks like the crop is very good. If we look at the reports, about 240,000 tonnes into the port of Bissau. I'm told about 95,000 tonnes has been exported, give or take. And looking at figures in Senegal, if an additional 50,000 plus tonnes went through Senegal, which seems likely looking at the stats, this would be the largest crop in history in Guinea-Bissau. That's really interesting because earlier in the year, just like in Cote d'Ivoire, just like in Ghana, just like in Nigeria, we were told there was a problem. So we need to be very cautious when we look at some of the crop estimates when we get to February, March of next year. Meantime, in Bissau, it's really positive on production. That's the last origin with high quality. I would expect that material to sell out, if it hasn't already done so, in the next couple of weeks. So our overall market situation, summing it up, the big crop gets bigger. And we've been talking about this since March. We expected a big crop. There were lots of rumors to the contrary. Well, if you add all the forecasts up right now, 2025 will be the record cashew crop globally. Demand remains resilient, despite the chat about tariffs and trade and higher prices. Europe, China, India, all looking good in terms of demand. Southern Hemisphere crops coming along soon. Estimates look positive. The tariff roller coaster is specifically referring to the US market because the impact elsewhere seems, for now at least, negligible. Situation is clearer, but no clarity. And the US authorities seem to prefer to play games with this than to make their minds up. And finally, what can we say? July has eased some of the concerns on demand. July has eased some of the concerns on supply. August is not going to give us an awful lot more information, but by September, we'll know about final estimates for demand for 2025. And my bet is it's going to be a really good year for demand, despite the disruptions earlier in the year. And this is something that rolls on into our longer term perspective. So if we start to look at some of the trends in the current market and how they might play out over the next 10 years, we can see how these have already started. But let's look first of all at the big picture, and let's just look at tree nuts generally. We rarely do this, and we should put ourselves in the context of the big picture tree nuts market. So tree nuts production is growing. Tree nuts production is growing significantly. And if we look at the figures in kernels, we see growth of about 4.7%. Cashews growing just above the average, but products like pistachio and walnuts are growing quickly. Pistachio particularly is interesting because it can be a competition for cashews in that snack segment. And if we look at share, we see that cashews and pistachios are around about the same share. Pistachio slightly higher for now. Looking at that, we see fast growing production in pistachios and walnuts, medium growth in almonds and cashews, and slower growth in hazelnuts. And hazelnuts is really not in the same business as cashews. It's much more in the confectionery and bakery, whereas pistachio competes in the snack food sector, and almonds increasingly compete in snack food and in a whole wide range of applications. But we need to temper these historical positive trends in production and point out that there are disruptors, and particularly climate change. So climate change is going to disrupt production of tree nuts in the coming decade. Various reasons for that, particularly if we look in California, the world's leading producer of products like almonds, pistachios, major producer of walnuts, access to water is becoming a problem. There's those famous predictions written that water will become the new oil, and that would appear to be the case. The shortage of water in California is going to limit the expansion of production and increase the cost of production in the years to come, and that has already started. If we look at hazelnuts, climate change is causing lower temperatures, particularly in the spring. Hazelnuts are vulnerable to late frost, and that's a risk. So the ideal climate for growing hazelnuts on the Black Sea coast of Turkey is changing. Elsewhere, and now we talk cashews, higher temperatures in West Africa and Southeast Asia, and we have seen some weather patterns that can be disruptive in recent years. All of these factors can disrupt these positive trends and possibly create greater volatility in the markets in the years to come. On the other side of the coin, looking at consumption, world tree nut consumption is growing. And these are figures from the INC, all tree nuts. And what we see is that in higher income countries, growth still positive, around about 4%, but it's middle income countries that are driving the consumption of tree nuts worldwide. We're going to have another look at that in a moment. So we see very positive, this import market, 166 billion US dollars, imports growing at 4% up to 2024. That is about the same speed as production. So supply and demand in tree nuts generally, although it is volatile, it's very closely matched. And this is what causes price volatility. What are the major markets for tree nuts? Well, the darker the blue in the slide on your screen, the greater the consumption. So if we look at China, it's about almonds, it's about cashews, it's about pistachio and macadamia. Now, macadamia is a small market, but cashews and pistachios are not, and China is a significant and growing consumer of those and doesn't grow those. And that's the interesting fact. China does not grow cashews and cannot grow cashews for reasons of climate. India is the other huge market, and this market is growing quickly. Big for almonds, big for pistachios, but the leading market for cashew nuts and growing quickly. What we're calling West Asia, or what used to be known as the Middle East, is also a significant market, significant in almonds, pistachios, and cashews. The US market, though mostly, with the exception of cashews, mostly consuming its own produced product, and Europe. So Europe is probably now, and over the last decade, the key market. 40% of the world's almonds, between 19 and 21% of the world's cashews, depending on how you quantify the total supply, most of the world's hazelnuts, a huge share of the world's pistachios. So this is the market where there has been significant growth and has a significant share, but it's not growing as quickly as either India or China, especially when it comes to cashew nuts. So these are our major markets, all Northern Hemisphere markets. You'll notice very little consumption in Africa. That's something for the future. Very little consumption in Central or South America, and moderate consumption in Eastern Europe, which is also growing. Countries like, well, Poland has already grown, and these countries of Eastern Europe are set to grow in their consumption of nuts. So looking forward, in the big picture of tree nuts, we see strong growth in Europe, China and India, and I don't think it's an overstatement to say that they are on the verge of a growth surge. We see high value markets already established, particularly Europe and the Middle East. And then we see some trends in supply chains. So buyers want shorter supply chains. They want traceability, they want sustainability. They want their needs met in terms of quality, residues, treatment of labor, generally good agricultural and good manufacturing practices. And never make the mistake of thinking that that's just a European thing. It's not. Food safety is a big issue in India, it's a big issue in China, and standards are getting more and more stringent every year. And so is the ability of the authorities in those countries to monitor and control the distribution of food for consumers. This can change. We can see some major changes. If we just think about African cashew kernels going from a 5% market share to a 20% market share in the European Union in 5 years. If we look at walnuts as another example, where Chile has become, within a decade, became a major supplier. So things can change. There has been a history. If you go back long enough, we'll see major changes in the supply of almonds, walnuts, pistachio nuts, and cashew nuts. Question is, in this positive environment, growth in demand, positive trends, can cashews make the cut? Can cashews become part of this or sustain the growth that has already been seen in the sector? So we look at some of the big issues over the next decade. So particularly supply chain sustainability, and particularly in this era of climate change. Now, climate change isn't something for a decade, but we're just looking at a decade window in this discussion. Supply chain sustainability is not just about the environment. We talk about it, we talk about the whole range, everything from the economic to the social to the environmental sustainability. Changing consumer demands related to sustainability, but also related to changes in the pattern of consumption. Things like more snacking, what they sometimes call grazing, the development of so-called modern retail in countries like India, the development of online sales. In India, it's been a phenomenon. In China too. And I think we are seeing in our sector a big shift in demand from the West, previously driven by Europe and the United States, to the East. We've seen the growth in India already over the years. We're now seeing China and other countries will also grow. A country like Indonesia, a huge country, has a taste for snacks, grows cashews, could easily turn into a net importer. Other big issue is domestic demand in producing countries. So I would particularly relate this to the situation in African countries, large populations who basically don't consume cashew nuts, but could. How's that going to work out over the next 10 years? We should also mention that domestic demand in India is already huge, but Indian production has not been growing. So how does India manage that? Does it become a bigger and bigger importer Or can India do something about the slow growth in production? And finally, of these big issues, and again, this is particularly relevant in Africa, and especially now as we end one harvest season in West Africa and begin another in East Africa, the way the sector is organized and regulated. We've seen increasing regulation, more and more rules, more and more taxes, more and more policy. Has had a positive effect, but there are still some enormous anomalies between countries and a lack of consistency. And there is a little bit of a, well, let's try it and see. And often that hasn't worked. We spoke about Benin and the ban on export of RCN already, and how that hasn't yet transitioned into a genuine growth in processing. Let's look at demand. What are the big consumption trends in demand? And there's trends and there's questions. India is the driver of world demand of cashews. So as India grows, if India is going to continue to just be an importer of raw cashew nuts, and it's about 60% of Indian demand is met with imported raw cashew nuts, will India be in a better position to buy raw cashew nuts than European buyers of kernels, for example? Will the higher prices to be paid by Indian processors to service their own market, will that price out African processors in the future? We've seen governments react to that with taxation in West Africa. We've seen all kinds of mechanisms, windows, export windows, restrictions on trade, all used to try and ensure that that doesn't happen. It is a big question for the future because the growth of demand in India is inevitable. If we look in the long term, even we could describe them as traditional markets. We've seen strong growth in Europe in recent years. We've seen strong growth in the US last year, but generally a relatively sluggish growth. When we look at this, can this growth be maintained? We've got price volatility, we've got sustainability, we've got issues with quality, and we've got price competitiveness, particularly in the United States related to domestic produced tree nuts. So there are still questions about demand in those traditional countries. There seem to be fewer questions about China, where consumption has grown quickly. Imports have doubled in 8 years, and if you apply that forecasting forward, well, it goes literally off the charts. And I'm going to show you that a little bit later on. What would happen if these growth levels were to continue? Let's say the growth levels of the last 2 years were to continue over a longer period, and it is quite stark when we look at that. In Africa, still the question remains regarding domestic consumption in African countries. What can be done to stimulate domestic consumption? Will African consumers consume more cashew nuts as time goes on? That's a big question. It's not an essential factor for growth in the market, but it would make a certain amount of sense if domestic consumption was to grow. I don't think whether or not African consumers warm to cashew nuts, I don't think it changes the overall pattern for the next 10 years. But it could change the way the business is done, and it could particularly impact the sustainability profile of the cashew sector. So let's look at some of those long-term trends. And I think what we're seeing is a shift to Asia. If we look at growth levels, so I've just broken out major markets. So we have China, and we see increasing growth from the 10-year trend, which was strong, to the 5-year trend, which is very strong. West Asia, North Africa, strong trend, getting stronger. India, long-term growth, which has now started to accelerate again. We're looking again in India at the kind of growth we saw in the decade from 2000 onwards, where we're now seeing accelerating growth in consumption. East Asia, excluding China, again, if we take imports to all of those countries, so here we're talking about Japan, Korea, we're talking about Thailand, we're talking about Indonesia, and I've put into that calculation, I've also put in Australia and New Zealand. So again, we see accelerating growth. So in these 4 areas, Asian markets, we see accelerating growth, whereas in Western Europe and in sub-Saharan Africa, we've seen a deceleration of growth. And this is what I think is happening. We're seeing a shift to Asia. It's happening right across economic activity, and it's no surprise that that's reflected in the cashew sector. So look at some of our key trends. Traceable and transparent supply chains, responsible sourcing. I use the EU logo there because the EU has been a leader in that, but that's following in other markets. Food safety, and particularly chemical residue levels. There's a big signal there for countries where the regulation of inputs is poor, and there's a big signal for countries where the use or overuse of chemicals is common. In marketing, we see storytelling and conscience-driven consumption. That's good news for African processors, because the story told by African processors is much more linked to the local community than, for example, if the raw cashew nuts are imported for processing. Big increase in consumption in the BRICS plus countries. So we're talking about India, Brazil, we're talking about China. And these are the areas where we're seeing the fastest growth in consumption. And to a lesser level of importance, a diversification in applications. Talked about a lot, doesn't mean a huge amount yet for the actual consumption. Now let's think about those really positive trends, add in the shift to Asia, add in strong growth in Europe, and then just consider what we're likely to see in the next 10 years is a much more diversified market. We're much more likely to see balance between imports in North America, Europe, West Asia, and East Asia, including China. So a much more diversified market. In other words, more competition for product. How does production look? Will production be able to meet those kinds of demands? So I think in production, we're seeing a few key trends that are likely to feed into the growth in consumption and likely to respond to it. First of all, more origin-based processing. Mainly that means more processing in African countries, because Africa's 58% of the world's cashews are grown in African countries. Greater supply chain linkages. So whether you're in Africa linking to a local co-op, or you're in Vietnam linking to a supplier in Africa, your customers are going to talk about greater supply chain linkages. They want to know, where did this product come from? They want to know the story behind it, and they want you to be able to manage risk by having a traceable and well-organized supply chain. We're going to see improved technology in processing. There's nothing immediately round the corner, but that's going to happen. I can't imagine that there isn't another big step forward in processing, and it's probably in areas of mechanization, probably in areas of improved product sorting and cleaning. As we mentioned, we're going to see an impact of climate change. We will see reduced use of chemical inputs. So what does that mean? Well, it probably means less risk, but it probably also means lower yields. Is there an alternative? And we do see some significant alternatives to the use of chemicals that have been successful. But short term, it's a bigger strain to get higher yields if you can't use inputs. Look at the case of Tanzania. Look at the impact of the improvements in the distribution system for sulfur over the last few years. Without that, production would not be growing at the speed it has been growing. And I think we're going to see more consumer packing at origin. I think we're going to see that particularly in Vietnam, but we're going to see it elsewhere too, where the product is finished before export. That could have a significant impact, particularly on markets like Europe and China, which generally speaking remain open to free trade. So cashew processing, well, we got some big issues. So first of all, if we look at Vietnam and the various kinds of processing, small and manual processing, larger, huge factories, mid-sized factories, and then the kind of clean and pack model, or the packing center model, as it used to be called. Big issues there is, first of all, tight margins, a long supply chain. That's been changed a little bit by the changes in supply from Cambodia, but it still is, generally speaking, a long supply chain. There are so many different models of cashew processing in Vietnam, but it does seem set to tend toward the larger factories. In India, the big issue to my mind is investment in mechanization. That will mean fewer jobs, but more efficient factories, much more able to meet the needs of modern consumers, much more able to meet the growth in modern retail in India, the growth in internet sales in India. Africa, well, it's a new sector. It's growing quickly. It is mechanized, but there's still a lot of issues in African cashew processing. Still issues of poor installation of the equipment, failure to utilize the full capacity, poor development of supply chain, and the lack of the availability of really well qualified technical managers. A lot of issues. Now, we've seen tremendous growth, but there are a lot of issues still to be solved, and they're weighing heavily on the sector right now. And in Brazil, we got a small number of mechanized factories, and the big issue in Brazil is raw material. So Brazilian cashew sector cannot expand unless it grows more cashews, and that hasn't really been happening in recent years. So again, let's focus on Africa, and let's focus on processing in Africa. And if we look at the trend, the overall volume trend, we can see it's very strong. It's growing at about 20% every year in recent years. It is highly concentrated. So let's just have a look at countries. So on the chart on the right, you can see three things: installed capacity, processed in 2023, processed in 2024, and you can see that Ivory Coast or Cote d'Ivoire leads by miles. 2 in every 3 cashews processed in Africa are processed in Cote d'Ivoire. Countries like Mozambique, Tanzania, Nigeria, Ghana have been increasing their processing, but still remain with issues to solve and capacity to add. And when we look at that, we see relatively poor levels of capacity utilization. No country is reaching the kind of level of capacity utilization that would be considered optimum. The best is Mozambique at 78%, according to our calculations. And some of the countries, Tanzania, for example, well, 70%, but it's a tiny, tiny industry, only processing about 5% of the crop. Overall, significant room for improvement. Now, we will see more processing in Africa this year. I think we will see more nuts processed. I think it will be up significantly on last year, but many of these issues remain, and they won't go away quickly. They will be an influence over the next 10 years. Trends in processing have changed. So when we look, we want to focus particularly on Africa with its problems. Cambodia, a relatively new large-scale producer without a processing industry so far, and India, where we're seeing a transition. India will transition to mechanization in the coming years, and that's challenging. So big issues in processing. The mechanization of processing, which means an increase in scale, and an increase in scale means need for more money, need for more working capital. That's something that's often forgotten. Yes, high-scale factories are more efficient, costs can be reduced, but you need a lot more working capital. So you need more money to build the factory, and you need more money to run it. It's the end of mass employment. The days of tens of thousands of workers employed in the cashew industry are gone. So you can do today with 500 people what you couldn't do 20 years ago with 5,000 people. And that is certainly having an impact. It's having an impact in a number of ways. First of all, entry is easier because you need fewer people and you need fewer people to train, and therefore it's easier to do that. But it also is going to change the way governments look at the sector over the longer term. Cashews were once seen as an incredibly interesting way to create mass employment. So you had the interface between a mass impact on smallholders and a mass impact on employment of many, many people. And that was, and rural employment too. And that was regarded by governments very positively. What happens when we have large scale factories employing fewer people? Well, it may well cause governments to look at the situation a little bit differently. And we're going to see some factories become obsolete. And that's a fact. And we are going to see some of the factories that were built perhaps not too long ago get to a point where they're now obsolete. So there are huge challenges in processing over the next 10 years. Capital investment, machine procurement, power supply, big issue in many African countries, and the management of machines. So the challenge changes from the management of people to the management of machines. And if it goes wrong, you get much more breakage of kernels, greater breakage of kernels. A changes the mix of available product, and B changes the cost and the profit margin pretty dramatically. But there are also huge opportunities. Faster entry to the market, reduced dependence on labor, lower cost of processing, greater reliability, and of course, easier management of food safety when you're using machines. So we're seeing changes in consumption, very positive changes in consumption. We're seeing a question mark over production. We'll have another look at that in a moment. Generally, we've been seeing positive trends. We're also seeing big changes in processing and huge challenges around that. We have seen over 40 years successive waves of cashew processing investment come and go. Is this different? Will it stick this time, especially for African countries? Governments seem to think it will. And what we're seeing with governments is much more regulation. I've picked out Africa, but there's also more regulation in other countries. We see the ban on exports in a country like Benin. We see changes in Cote d'Ivoire. We see the subsidies now being phased out for processors over the next 4 years, but further intervention by the government is possible. We see minimum pricing strategies, sometimes high, sometimes low, sometimes politically influenced. We see the changes in Tanzania, and it looks as if there'd be a few answers to some of the problems of last year, at least the problems for processors of last year, in that they were being taxed in the supply chain and the payments were via the cooperative unions. That may change now in the coming season, and that would be good news. Hopefully we'll get some more information on that in our first September webinar. And in other countries, we're seeing a real mix. We're seeing a policy framework in Ghana, but it hasn't really been implemented so far. We're seeing changes in Burkina Faso and Mali, and this is certainly likely to have an impact in coming years. So it's not always been the case that policy on cashews has been good news. In many, many cases, it's actually backfired. And this will have an impact in the coming years. Sustainability. So this is a big thing for consumers. especially for Europeans, but also for consumers all over the world. And what's really clear is that the current setup of the raw cashew nut trade, 3+ million tons a year moved around the world to be processed, this isn't sustainable. It just doesn't. If you look at the climate action goals, if you look at the standards, it just doesn't make it. Now, it's necessary. I'm not saying it's not, but it's not sustainable in the way that we are currently defining sustainability. Growing and processing at origin, of course, is more sustainable. But if we look at buyers, and particularly retailers, and particularly if we look at the absence of retailers in the cashew chain, and I'm talking about big chains, I'm talking about supermarkets particularly, we have to ask ourselves, are they really serious about sustainability? Or is it still just about price for them? And that is a question that will be answered in the next 10 years and could have a huge impact on the way this sector operates. I also want to highlight something which sometimes is neglected, and that is the working practices in cashew processing plants. Outsourcing of labour, adherence to international conventions, our buyers checking on working practices in cashew factories. That photo, by the way, is an old photo, but it shows some of the practices in a factory going back some years. Most of this has changed, but there are still various problems with working practices, labour rights, labour conditions in cashew factories. That's something that could bite us in the future. Any kind of a scandal is a serious scandal in this area. Human rights are a serious issue. We can't ignore it just in the name of increasing processing or making money or improving tax intakes. Let's have a look at some of the longer term consumption and production trends. So here you've got a chart 2008-9 up to 2024. The green is production. The red is demand. It's in raw cashew nut tons. So over that period, we saw, first of all, that production growth was driven by West Africa. Major production increases were all in West Africa. We saw growth in Ivory Coast, we saw Ghana, Nigeria, you name it. Every country increased its production, and that was significant. Then we came to 2019-2020, and we saw this remarkable surge in production in Cambodia. And that, as you can see, pushed production way above consumption, and we all know what happened to cashew prices in that period. So a big step upward as trees planted during a period of high prices started to come to maturity, and we started to get this situation where, for the first time in many years, production exceeded demand. And that happened over 3-4 years. It was interrupted last year, strong demand, weaker crop, and you get at least on paper, a situation where consumption exceeds production. And therefore that's affected by the inventories, and inventories were reduced last year. But we did see in 2022 and 2023 significant growth in the inventory of RCN as the years opened. What would happen if we took those trends and just simply projected them 10 years forward? And this is what would happen. We would see an increasing gap between consumption and production. So this is, if we took the 10-year trend in consumption and charted it out toward 2035, and the 10-year trend in production and forecast that out. Now, look, I know the world doesn't work that way, but that's what would happen if the trends of the last 10 years continued. Production would, by the way, be driven by Africa, because it's safe to say now at this point that although Cambodia will continue to grow, it's very unlikely that there'll be another surge in Cambodia in the way we saw one going back 3 or 4 years. It also seems unlikely to me that either India or Vietnam will increase their production significantly. India will continue to grow, but there's no indicator right now that we'll see any major increase in Indian production. And in Vietnam, it seems more than likely that production will stay somewhere in or around about the current level. Scenario 1. Things don't change, the trends continue, this is where we end up. Production exceeds demand significantly. Not going to happen. So we had another look, and we pulled a lot of numbers apart here over the last week when we were looking at this, and we said, what's the most realistic situation? So based on the fact that India does not increase by more than the kind of 2% that we've been seeing over the last few years, and that Cambodia returns to more normal growth rates. We don't see this big step up and step down. What we would see is something like this. So in this case, you see 2025, the figures, the projection kind of confirms the reality, spike in production, and then relatively strong growth, matching the growth in consumption. So demand follows the current trend. Production switches back to being Africa driven, and we get this balance. So in this situation, not all raw cashew nuts make it to market, of course. So this doesn't mean that we've got a huge surplus, by nothing like that. It does mean we get steady increase. It looks like 7 million tons, 7.5 million tons production will come about, and that consumption will pretty much match that. Let's be a bit more optimistic. What if we said that demand continues to grow based on the short-term trends, so that demand grows at levels that we've seen in the last 3-4 years? That means that you get big demand growth in China kicking in, you get big demand growth in the European Union kicking in, and now you get a completely different scenario. So now you get production continuing to grow at the levels that we project, slightly corrected for slower increase in India, Cambodia back to normal levels. But demand now is the orange bars, demand really starts to kick off. This growth, the average growth in this is about just over 6%, 6.05%. And that's based on the kind of growth we've seen since 2022. And that changes things. In 10 years, really actually from 5 years, we start to get the potential demand exceeding production. So there's the discussion. Will demand slow down and go back to the levels of 10-year, which is around about 3%, or will it continue to grow at the levels we've recently been seeing? Now we're talking around about just over 6%. And then within 10 years, you get a technical deficit starting to emerge. It's a big question. Now, this is less likely, because it seems to me less likely that demand will continue to grow at this kind of pace. But having said that, we are talking about major market entrants. We're talking about huge populations. Particularly, we're talking about India and China as consumers of cashews. Cashews are already central to consumption of tree nuts in India and general foodstuffs in India. In China, they're just becoming into that range. If that continues, we could get a scenario that looks like that. And that would change the situation massively. Would the market respond with additional production? Probably. But the period for that to kick in would be toward the end of the decade, which means those trees would start to come online in the middle of the next decade. So we're ending up in a situation of probably higher prices and extreme price volatility from 2030 onwards. Meantime, if we do get poor crops, if we do get crops affected by climate change, it seems quite likely that we get price volatility and higher prices. So long term, one would have to say that the trends are positive and that the trend in prices is likely to be higher in the coming years. So what might the sector look like in 10 years? This is me now putting a few things together, drawing a few conclusions. And I think it might just look like this. I think China might be the world's largest market in volume terms. I think India, production may have increased, but India will remain a fast growing net importer. So India will not become self-sufficient in cashews according to that. In Vietnam, so the green ones are the producers, the blue ones are the consumers. India is blue and green because it does both. So looking at Vietnam, a producer, a processor, I think less processed volumes, but more processed, higher value, more roasted, more consumer packs, more finished products. But probably importing a little bit less. Cambodia could be by then the largest producer in the world. It's possible, and could be a significant processor. Now, if we think Ivory Coast this year, 1.5 million tons, Cambodia probably approaching 950,000 tons this year, that's a big call in 10 years. We're looking at a big change in Cambodia. I don't think we're going to see a big step up, but I think we will see steady growth. But on the other side, I think production in West African countries will stabilize production growth. What about markets? Indonesia, currently a producer. I think Indonesia will become a net importer of cashews. Huge population, consumption of snacks, consumption of the kind of foods that cashews go well with. East Africa, for me, it's a 1 million ton production, but processing still struggling. 10 years from now, there will be more processing in East Africa, but I think it will still continue to struggle unless it is supported. West Africa, production growth, to my mind, has slowed down a little bit 10 years from now, mainly due to the impact of climate change. But most of the cashews grown in West Africa will be processed in West Africa. So there'll be less going to Vietnam. Some will obviously go to Vietnam. A lot will go to India. But most of the cashews produced in West Africa will tend to be processed there. Brazil will become much more a consumer. Consumption of cashews has been increasing in Brazil, and I think Brazil will become, by 2035, a net importer of cashew kernels. Europe remains second largest consuming area, and the United States, it's a mature market. It's becoming more and more a closed market, as we know, and I think it probably ends up static in terms of growth. So slow growth, going back to the trends of pre-2024. Quite a different picture. Shift to Asia in demand, strong growth in demand, slowing growth in production, and a little bit of a shift back toward Asia in terms of production growth. East Africa is key. If we look at Africa, let's ask the question, does Africa hold the key to the next decade in cashews? I think it probably does. It's certainly the center of production and increasingly the center of processing. But how does Africa cope with the short-term problems? Is the cashew chain, the supply chain, we've talked about traceability, we've talked about sustainability, we've talked about shorter supply chains, we've talked about storytelling. Is the African cashew chain aligned with those trends? That's a big question mark. In the longer term, can production growth be maintained in Africa in the face of climate change? Again, we're talking about severe impact, we're talking about smallholders, we're talking about potentially production moving south in countries like Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. Let's say Africa does increase production. Let's say that production growth can be maintained. Will the infrastructure be able to cope? So right now we see world production this year somewhere between 5.6 and 5.8 million tons. If we look at the forecast, that gets up towards 7 million tons. Big growth of that, a big part of that growth will be in African countries. How will the infrastructure cope? So where are the warehouses to store post-harvest? Where are the drying yards? How will the ports look? How would the port of Bissau be handling double the cashew volume that it has today? What would it be? What would the situation be in Cote d'Ivoire if there were 300,000 tons left in the country at the end of July rather than 100,000 tons? And these are major questions and major threats to the development of the sector. Answering them would suggest Africa holds the key. Failure to answer them would certainly suggest a retracement, a loss of importance of Africa in the cashew sector. And of course, we have to focus on farmers because at the end of the day, this is essential source of livelihood for smallholders, particularly in Africa. So will cashews, with increased tax take from the government, failure to develop infrastructure, complex policy and regulation, will cashews continue to offer growers, smallholder growers, a way out of low incomes? That will incentivize production. If it doesn't, farmers will find other things to do. And big question we need to ask when we look at this, we look at the infrastructure, we look at the method of growing, we look at processing, we look at the supply chain as it's currently organized. Is this sustainable in the era of climate change? My guess is Africa holds the key to the next decade. But there are enough questions to mean that you can argue with that and say, no, we will see a shift in consumption to Asia. And with that, we would also see a shift in production. Time will tell. So the long-term impact, from my perspective, I think in the coming years, in a normal year, 26, 27, 28, 29, production probably is greater than consumption, keeping prices stable, probably somewhere around the current range. In a bad year, and we are talking about the impact of climate change, it could look very different. However, looking at the infrastructure, we may continue to be in a situation where some of the raw cashew nuts doesn't make it to market. So it has to be processed at origin because the infrastructure to ship increasing volumes is just not there and may struggle to cope. And where we're seeing plenty of incidences to give valid evidence to that conclusion, even in this year, but certainly last year. Processing, definitely a shift to Africa. I cannot see any reason that processing will not increase in African countries, but Vietnam remains strong. India, of course, remains primarily focused on its domestic market. I find it hard to imagine any significant change in Indian government policy that would, for example, allow the import of cashew kernels. I think we can rule that out for now. Consumption shift to Asia, we've talked about. Probably, in a normal year, more stable prices. I think this becomes range bound. But when we get one of those years where we get a bad crop, we're going to see very volatile pricing because that balance between supply and demand over the next decade will get tighter and may well shift in favor of consumption as time goes on. And of course, we're going to see more volatility. Climate change is going to create volatility in production. And as it does so, it's going to create a situation reflecting back on more volatile prices. So the closer that the supply and demand is balanced, the more likely you get strong levels of volatility when that's disturbed. It's going to be very interesting period. I've no doubt about that. Of course, cashews are always interesting. I've always found them interesting anyway. But this is a really challenging period coming up where we're seeing shifting trends. In the past, we've seen shifting trends in production, slow change in processing, and relative stability in the big trends in consumption. It seems to me in the coming years, we're going to see big changes in consumption, generally positive, but big changes in markets, greater diversification of markets. We're going to see changes in processing, a move to Africa, and we're going to see question marks over production, mainly driven by the impact of climate change. That's my take on the next 10 years. Of course, a lot of this is conjecture. A lot of this is taking numbers, forecasting them forward, taking trends, imagining how they might be in the future. This could be a really interesting conversation. This could be a conversation that we might pursue at the African Cashew Alliance conference in Tanzania in November. But for now, let me hand you back to Stella. And Stella, have we got any questions or comments or observations?
Yes, Jim, thank you very much for the presentation. Yes, we have questions. The first one is, what factors are driving the push for mechanization in India, and what technologies are they employing? Vietnam or homegrown technologies?
Well, I think that the driving factors are factors like the movement of the processing industry to North India, closer to markets. I think that's one factor. The increasing dependence on imported raw cashew nuts means that you can locate your factory close to a market in North India, close to a port in North India. You don't need to be near to the supply, as would have been the case in the past. We've been seeing that trend for a long time. I think increasing labor cost is another aspect, and increasing cost of raw material, meaning that there's pressure on overall costs, and there's no doubt that mechanization can do that, but also aspects like required better food safety in India and overall efficiency, and the entry of larger companies too will impact that. The technology they're using, there is quite a lot of very good technology being introduced in India, and in some aspects India leads. Generally speaking, we also are seeing quite a lot of Vietnamese equipment sold to Indian factories. It's ready, it's available, and it's relatively competitive in terms of its cost. And of course, Vietnamese technology is tried and tested, and it's tried and tested over a whole range of different origin raw materials. Stella?
Jim, to what extent does ban on exports of raw cashew nuts hold success of West African countries?
Sorry, I don't quite understand that question. Could you repeat it?
To what extent does the ban on export of raw cashew nut hold success of West African countries? The question is coming from Ifeyi from Nigeria.
Well, the impact of the ban of raw cashew nuts. So there are only two countries that have banned the export of raw cashew nuts. One is Kenya, and the other is Benin. Other countries have, from time to time, curtailed the export, but no one has banned it other than those two for now, at least in Africa. What we've seen is that, first of all, it's very, very difficult to enforce a ban. So it has, in the case of Benin, forced a lot of players into what is an illegal trade. And with extensive land borders, differences in policy in neighboring countries, it's been very, very difficult to enforce. And that in turn has caused the ambition to extend the volumes processed in the country to be curtailed. So I personally feel that it is something of a negative move, and it would be better to have a well-managed system which would give processors access to raw material without curtailing the export of raw cashew nuts. at least of the surplus. If we look at the experience in Kenya, over many years following the ban on the export of raw cashew nuts, the production failed, and Kenyan production of cashew nuts declined sharply following the imposition of the ban. There is some sign of it coming back to life now, but it is much lower than it was 20 years ago. It just hasn't worked, to be honest. Stella.
Going back to your look for the sector in 10 years, you mentioned that Indonesia changed to be a net importer. What could be the reason?
Big population, becoming more affluent with a taste for these kinds of products. It's often forgotten that Indonesia is a huge country. There is a well-established snack food industry in Indonesia. There is significant consumption of cashew nuts. And of course, the opportunity to expand production in Indonesia is limited. So therefore, the likelihood is that consumption will increase. Indonesia does already import cashew kernels in the second half of the season, having exported raw cashew nuts early. Therefore, there is a situation that could arise where Indonesia becomes a net importer, and that the exports of raw cashew nuts from Indonesia declines. Indonesian raw cashew nuts are very high quality, often large size, usually high yielding. So that's my logic for saying Indonesia becomes a net importer.
Thank you, Jim. The next GME is on September 3rd. You mentioned earlier that there will be a focus on Tanzania. What should we expect?
So in September, we're getting towards the Tanzanian cashew season. So we're hoping to have a representative of the Cashew Board of Tanzania to tell us about regulatory changes in the coming season. We're hoping to have a representative of cashew processors in Tanzania to update us on the situation in processing, some of the challenges they face and some of the successes, and there are some notable successes. So we're going to we'll talk about the market, of course, as always, and then we'll focus on the upcoming season in Tanzania. And we will, by the way, update that with a second session focused on Tanzania later in the year once the auction starts and we get some idea on the pattern of RCN exports.
Thank you very much, Jim, for today's session.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone who joined. Thank you to everyone who asked a question. I'm looking forward to chatting again on cashews early in September. In the meantime, take care. You can see my contacts are on the screen, and this has been facilitated by some important and generous sponsors, and thanks to them too. Stella, let me finish by saying thanks to you, our 85th edition. Well done, ACA. Well done, Stella.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. And I would also want to say thank you to the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ Move Com Cashew Project, the Sustainable Nuts Initiative, and the Cashew Club. All Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick sessions are available on the ACA YouTube channel, where you can watch 85 recordings anytime. And the channel's name is African Cashew A. And mark your calendars, the 19th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo will take place from November 18th to 21st of this year at GINEC in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Register now and enjoy 40% discount on all conference rates, as the early birds rates are ending on August 31st. Until September 3rd, enjoy the 30 minutes networking session before the end of the webinar. See you next time.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, team.